All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And for the folks who are joining us from different time zones, good morning and good evening. So, this is my very first session that I'm doing as a part of the HTMD conference. So, I'd like to begin by thanking all the organizers and everyone who has been behind bringing up this wonderful conference. So with that, let's get started. I believe this entire conference is completely focused on how to manage devices, so on and so forth. But for a moment, for some time, let's sort of switch gears and talk from a security standpoint. So as you could see in my slide now, today I'll be talking about how can you protect identities and access to your resources with Azure Active Directory. A little bit about myself. So my name is Vignesh Ganeshan. I've been in the industry for almost close to, it's going to be close to 11 years now. I work as an enterprise cloud architect and technology strategist for a US MNC. I've been in the Microsoft 365 space for a very, very long time. And it's been off late that I've started doing a lot of M365 related security stuff. So our session also today is going to be a lot more focused on M365 security related stuff. Okay. I've been blogging a lot, even though I don't do that a lot these days. I have my own blog site called Vignesh SharePoint Thoughts, where I write a lot of blog. Then I also contribute my articles to European SharePoint Community, Collab 365, C Sharp Corner, and other blog sites also. I've had the pleasure to speak on a plethora of webinars, user group, and conferences across the globe. And I'm the chapter lead for the C Sharp Corner Bangalore chapter, if at all you know the C Sharp Corner forum. And I'm also the ambassador for the AOS India community. I've been a C Sharp Corner MVP for 3 times in a row, and over the years, I had the pleasure to complete more than 20 plus Microsoft certifications, especially on the unified collab and communication space. And off late, as I said, a lot in the security side of the house. And just in case, if you know the Microsoft 365 Power Platform and Cloud Security India user group, so I'm the one who founded and I'm the chief organizer of that user group. Well, that's all about myself. So let's sort of jump in. Um, just to set the tone for, or let's the tone or the mood for this presentation today, right? We all need to agree upon and understand one thing: the nature of business or even the kind of world that we are living in has changed a lot, at least in the past 2 years, right? Things are not exactly the same it was before, and it has just not disturbed our personal life, but also our work life. Okay, so what this means is the nature of the business and work has changed recently. And what you also need to understand that the conventional security tools that we had in our enterprise, they're not able to keep up to the pace, right? And also as a result of that, the cost of breaches and regulations are increasing. And that is something which we all know. If at all you've been reading a lot of hacking related or security related blog posts a lot these days, you would see that the rigor or the amount of attack which is happening on companies has really grown multifold over the past 2 years. Okay, and let's try to understand how the real modern workplace looks like these days, right? And this is just sort of a mind map which is going to help you sort of visualize how, let's say, people are connecting to their corporate resources, right? The current era that we are living on is we are not just using one single device to connect to our office resources, which could be your email or maybe any kind of company resources that you want to access, any kind of M365 resource, any kind of Azure resource, or it could be any kind of resource SaaS apps which is coming from different vendors also. So we have multiple devices. It could be your normal computer, your workstation as an endpoint, or it could even be your mobile device as an endpoint. And in addition to that, we also have a lot of partners and vendors who keep accessing our resources as the nature of the work that we have. Okay, so the point that I'm trying to make is we are living in a world, or the current workplace demands us to work in a lot more collaboration, and it also gives us ease of access to what we really need. We really want to get things done on the go, no matter wherever we are. While this really empowers us to be a lot more productive, we also need to understand that it has also literally opened doors for attackers to come in and steal whatever information they want to steal. Okay, and this has also resulted in a lot of in a lot of hacking or a lot of kind of threat. And threat landscape has been increasing a lot of late. And if at all you want to look at the current threat landscape, these are some interesting stats that I want to share. So 230 percentage of increased password spray attack this year alone, and 2 million compromised attacks have been detected. Compromised accounts have been detected in August 2020, and 5 billion attackers-driven sign-ins detected in August 2020, and 1/3 of all attacks on enterprise accounts involve phishing. So if at all you're somebody who's coming from a security background, maybe from cybersecurity, or you've been doing cloud security, you know that for a fact that password spray or compromised accounts or phishing has been the known attack vectors by by hackers of late, and that has always been the case. So any kind of attack which comes to a large enterprise has always been in this three fashion, and this has been the topmost. Of course, there are a lot of other attack vectors which hackers could use, but if at all you pull up the list and you want to go after and understand what are the different ways attackers or somebody with a malicious intent is coming inside and stealing information, these would be coming up as the top three. Okay, and this is how the current threat landscape looks like. While this all exists, we really need a solution, right, which can help us to make sure that it prevents our data or resources right in the front door, which I'm talking about something like a proper identity and access management solution, because identity and access management is sort of the front door. If you screw up that, that's it. So the attacker comes in and he could do enough damage even before you know, right? And there are a lot of identity and access management solutions out there. I'm not really going to say that Azure AD is the best, right? We all know for a fact that Okta has been the first cloud identity and access management solution in the world. They were the first to come up to be cloud only, and it is only then other vendors came into the space and they were capable enough to spin up a fully fledged cloud identity and access management solution, or even a hybrid identity and access management solution. Okay, but here are some interesting things which Azure AD can offer. And if at all you take a look at this, you could think of sharing accesses with guests, or maybe you could think of single sign-on. You could be thinking of MFA. You could be thinking of, let's say, I want to do PIM, like privileged identity management, or privileged access management. I want to join my devices. So anything that you can think from an identity and access management standpoint, Azure AD is capable enough of offering those capabilities. So you as an organization, or maybe the customer whom you're supporting, may not be using all these products, but just so that you know that Azure AD as of today is one of the heavily used identity and access management solution in the world, and it has a broad range of capabilities that it can offer. But for the sake of today's presentation, I'm not going to focus on everything. I'll be mainly touch basing upon the Azure AD multi-factor authentication, maybe Azure AD passwordless. Then I also want to spend a good amount of time on conditional access and identity protection. Okay, we all know that uniquely these products have a lot to offer. They are the best, security solutions that you can think of from the Azure AD side of the house. But what if they all can come together? What is the value prep that they can give when they all come together? So that's what we are going to talk about. And as I said, right, so this is going to be our core meat of today's presentation: protecting identities and securing access to resources. So we'll be looking at this into three different pillars. First, we'll be talking about how can you secure access to resources with strong authentication. As I said, your identity and access management is the front door. So if there is anything that you want to strengthen, that should be the first place that you need to go after. Okay. Now let's say, all right, I've taken care of the front door. So what next? Let's say the user comes in. What happens? Should I be having controls about what he's trying to do, what kind of information he's trying to access, from where he's trying to access? For that comes the second pillar. How can you enforce granular access control with real-time adaptive policies? Okay. This is where even if the user comes in, I want to make sure that I have full control, or I'm able to monitor what he's doing. Okay. And the third comes in wherein we want to automate risk detection and remediation. Even though you bring in so many security controls, you're monitoring, sometimes, we all know the fact that it so happens that something happens, and it is just that we want to make sure that you can't go behind every single alert or every single attack and make sure that you're able to remediate manually. So you want some kind of automation, which can, as you train it or by machine learning, it has the intelligence to remediate itself. Okay, so we'll be looking at these three different pillars and how these three different pillars can come together to protect the identities and provide secure access to your resources. So this is the core meat of today's presentation. So let's jump in. So let's focus on the first pillar, which is securing access to resources with strong authentication. Okay, for this, what I want to bring up is the Azure AD multi-factor authentication. I'm pretty sure everybody by now should be using this given the new normal that we are working on. I'm pretty sure every company, anybody who's using a Microsoft product would have enabled Azure AD. But what we need to understand is it brings up a really big question, that is Azure AD multi-factor authentication alone enough, or is there something else that we need to start looking at? Okay, so that's where your passwordless technology comes into picture, because we all know that with Azure AD multi-factor authentication, we are able to introduce a second factor of authentication. So the first could be your username and password, and then you want maybe a voice-based authentication coming in, or maybe an SMS, or maybe the Microsoft app authenticator, right? But we also need to understand that sometimes people are not really happy with this. Sometimes these things tend to annoy them. So that is where the world of passwordless comes into picture, right? So wherein we can start talking about how can we implement passwordless technology so that people don't really need to key in their username and password, and there are a lot of other passwordless technologies that Microsoft has introduced that we can take advantage of. I would also like to mention that of late, a lot of you might have seen that Microsoft has introduced passwordless technology for their commercial emailing system, which is nothing but your Hotmail. So if at all you haven't taken a look at it, I would really urge that you go ahead and enable the passwordless authentication for your Hotmail also. Now, how does an Azure AD multi-factor authentication work, right? This is sort of the question, like what really happens behind the scene, right? So it so happens that we all have a password, a username and password, and this concept has been there even since ancient times, right? And then something you have, such as a trusted device that is not easily duplicated like a phone or hardware key, and something that you are, which is, so this is the combination which really happens behind the Azure AD multi-factor authentication. So I'll just show a quick demo of how you can go ahead and start deploying your Azure AD multi-factor authentication if at all you haven't done that before. So here I am on my demo tenant. So I'm going to my Azure AD page here. So I'm going to spend a lot of time only on the Azure AD portal here because our entire session is related to that. Okay, I'll go to security. I'll go to multi-factor authentication, right? So this is the complete blade wherein you can go ahead and configure all your Azure AD multi-factor authentication related controls. Okay, now here comes the question, right? So how do I go ahead and enable this? Because you simply can't go ahead and turn it on. Of course, this is going to create a lot of noise, and I'm pretty sure if you have done this before, I know for a fact that this is not something which can be seamlessly deployed. Okay, it needs a proper sign off from the business. This is really going to upset a lot of people about why should I even keep on giving in a second factor of authentication, right? So should I just turn it on blindly for everyone, or should a proper exercise happen behind that, or how am I going to supposed to do it? Okay, so one way is maybe if you're a small organization and you simply want to turn it on, you can just come here, click on per user MFA and choose that, and just simply say enable multi-factor authentication for everyone. Just click on enable. The next time they're going to sign in, it is going to prompt them for a MFA registration, and they have to go through that process. Okay, or you want to really be somewhat cautious. You don't really want a lot of noise coming, and you don't really want to upset a lot of specifically people in the maybe somebody who's on the senior management level, right? Then what you could probably do is you could start doing this through Azure AD conditional access. So I'll come back to conditional access in the second pillar because that is the core focus, but I'm pretty sure everybody who has joined this session pretty much knows what conditional access is. Okay, so you could in fact go ahead and create a new policy like this. The way that I have created is you could simply come here and name your policy as if at all you want to do a pilot, and you can choose for what workloads or who should be the user. Here in this case, I'm telling as all users and cloud apps. Okay, for what kind of apps that you want to push the MFA, right? Should it be all cloud apps? right? I'm going to say for all cloud apps condition. So this is where you could play a little bit smart. If at all you don't want that MFA prompt coming in every time, okay? Wherein you could say that device platform, say if somebody is coming in from any device, or how do you want to do this, or maybe it is coming. So this, in a lot of organizations, you would see that they have configured the location, okay? If the user is not coming it within your office network, and if he's coming from the outside office network, you want an MFA prompt to come in, okay? Or also if the device state is something, if somebody is trying to access your office resources from outside a machine which is not joined to Azure AD, or which is something which is not joined to hybrid Azure hybrid AD, which is not hybrid Azure AD joined. Even in those cases, you can go ahead and say that I need an MFA prompt to come up. So the point that I'm trying to make is you could just simply go ahead and say, just turn it on and make the prompt coming on every time. It's just that it may not be a smart move, right? Because when people are accessing the office resources from their computer, you really do not want to do that, because it is simply going to annoy them. Wherein you could be really smart and say that only under certain conditions, I want the MFA prompt to come upon. Okay. All right. So just going back to my slide here. So now comes the question about, hey, what can be considered? And this is something which is very well available on Microsoft's documentation. So if at all you see, these are some pointers, or these are some examples for a bad password, okay? And these are some examples for a good password, better password, and passwordless. And you might really be thinking, like, who is even using passwords of this nature, right? Do really people use passwords such as 123456, QWERTY, and password? And just so you know, I was in fact looking at, when I was preparing for this session, I was in fact reading an interesting article which I want to share with everyone, right? And it really says that India's most popular used password is password. And that's how crazy it gets, right? And it's the same as in Japan. Maybe this is not the case with your office accounts, right? Because we have password complexity and a lot of other controls coming into picture. But when it comes to your commercial accounts, maybe it could be your Gmail, or it could be your other solutions that you might be using. So what the stat says that, so password has been the most common used password, and these are also other examples which are being used in India. Okay, so there is nothing really to joke about this. It so happens that this is what is happening in the current world. Okay. Now, I also spoke about the password-less technology. And as I said, that if at all you're not really comfortable with introducing a second factor authentication, but you still want to make sure that you have enough guardrails and you want to control how people can access your resources, passwordless is a very good technology to go after. And for that, I haven't really configured it, but I'll just, so you know, I'll go here, and you have different policies that you could push. And as of today, these are the passwordless technologies which Microsoft can support. Okay, you have your FIDO2 security key, fast identity online, and then you have Microsoft Authenticator, which is a native Microsoft solution. I'm pretty sure everybody might be using this. And then you also have text message and temporary access pass. So these are all the well-known password-less technologies. And I would say that Microsoft Authenticator has been the one which has been heavily used across the globe, at least by people who are using Microsoft solutions. Okay, so if you're really thinking of moving from a solution which has two-factor authentication to a password-less culture, then I would urge you to start looking at Microsoft Authenticator. But because a lot of companies have implemented this and they're really successful with that. Okay, but now here comes the question, right? So even though there are a lot of, let's say, all right, Vignesh, I get your point. Maybe I want to do multi-factor authentication and then I do a passwordless, but still a lot of attacks keep happening, right? So what is really considered as a good authentication method, or what is really considered as a bad authentication method? How do I gauge these solutions? How do I make a proper comparison or a justification? Right. So that's where this comparison comes really handy. It's not really a comparison. It is something that you might want to really look at before you go ahead and implement this. Okay. And this is some things which Microsoft has shared, right? So if you take a look at this, right, it says Windows Hello for Business, or your Microsoft and Windows Hello for Business. We all know that it is a very good biometric solution. It's not that a lot of laptops which has been in the past, at least the new devices which are coming in the market, they do support Windows Hello for Business, and a lot of companies are using this. But you need to make sure that the device that you're going after really supports this factor. And then we also have, and if you take a look at this, right, it clearly says that the security standards on these are high, and the usability and the availability is also high. But if you take a look at the other solutions here, most of us, I would say most of us are living in an era, or we are currently using SMS as our second factor authentication. Okay. And if you take a look at this, this has been given as medium. The security for this is really medium. And I'll really tell you why this is being considered as medium. Okay. I'm not sure how many of you had an opportunity to go ahead and read this blog, but later you can go ahead and really go through this. We all need to understand that your SMS, okay, it is happening over a PSTN network, right? It is coming from the vendor. That's the way it works. And these are really, really weak links, and it's quite possible that anybody can go after that and hack it. Social engineering, so anything that you can think of is really possible. If at all you haven't read this blog, please go ahead and read. It really calls out, the threats behind having SMS as your second factor authentication. And just in case you really want to understand about all the second factor, which one is really secure, which one can have attacks such as phishing, right? All those things, you can really go after these two blogs and read it. Okay, so it's gonna the blog. I even have this as in I have put it this on the last slide of my presentation. So later when the slides are made available to you, you can go ahead and read it. But it is a very good read. I would really urge you folks to go ahead and read this. So that's our first pillar. Now let's, so maybe you have taken care, you have all the controls in place so that, people are really vetted in the first gate itself, right? And only then they get to access what they get to access. Now let's see what happens. Okay, they come in. Okay, so now what happens? Maybe they're trying to access the resources. Maybe it could be an Azure resource. It could be a Dynamics 365 resource. It could be an M365 resource. Okay, you really want to make sure that you're enforcing granular controls or you're able to monitor. By monitor, what I mean is I really don't want you to look after what your users are doing. Okay, you really want to have a second pair of eyes when they are doing it, when they're doing it from a different place. Now, say maybe when people are working within their corporate network, things are good, you're very well taken care of, right? And even if you still want to monitor what they want to do, there are different solutions for this, there are different compliance solutions for that, and we are not going to talk about that here. Okay, what we are really bothered about is what if somebody wants to access my corporate resource outside of my corporate network. Okay, in those conditions or in those cases, what kind of granular controls that I can give into them. Okay, now for this, the solution that I want to introduce is conditional access. Okay, I'm going to talk about conditional access plus identity protection, but for a moment, let's take away identity protection. I'll come back to that at a later point. Let's focus on conditional access alone for now. Now, as the name itself says, and if you're somebody who's coming from a Google Cloud background, in the Google Workspace world, they call it as context-aware access, right? So it's the same thing, but it's just that they have a different naming convention there. As we all know, conditional access works based on certain user context, right? It looks at what kind of role you're playing in the organization. Are you an employee? Are you a partner? Or what kind of device you're coming from? Is it a device which is part of the company's directory? Or is it your personal device? On what kind of location you're trying to access from? Okay, is it within the corporate network, or is it some kiosk machine sitting in an airport or somewhere else? And also the client apps. Okay, are you using any legacy authentication or a legacy app? So all these kind of conditions go into picture. So every time you sign in, every time you're trying to access a Microsoft Cloud resource, in our case, let's pick Microsoft 365 alone. It is going to look into all these conditions, and once it looks into these conditions, only based upon that condition, it is going to throw you some controls. It's going to say, hey, whether you can have access to that particular solution, or maybe do I see that something is really abnormal? I want to challenge you with an MFA, or I really think that this cannot be you at all, and I want to block. Okay, this is what conditional access really does. Now let's try to bring in identity protection as well. So what is the power of conditional access plus identity protection? Okay, so We all know that M365 as a solution is heavily built with, it has a lot of AI, machine learning, heuristics algo, and a lot which goes into picture, right? We all need to understand that every single time, or as you start logging into the system, as you log in as a user, right, there is a profile which is built for you, and this profile is something which you can't see. Okay, based upon it, the machine itself is smart enough to understand, okay, you as a person, you normally log in from this particular location, maybe from India. This is your ISP, you come in from this particular network range. Okay, this is the device that you would normally access from. So it has a profile which is very well built, and if at all it detects any anomaly, something which is abnormal to this, so that is when it is going to really ask. So those kind of machine learning goes into picture, and also a proper session risk is raised. So this session risk and all these things, this is possible with by bringing identity protection together. Now later in the third pillar, I'll be talking in detail about identity protection. But just so you know, right, what do you mean by session risk? What is that engine which is calculating that session risk? Where is this risk even coming from, right? If at all you're concerned and if at all you want to know, please bear in mind that it is the Azure AD identity protection which is doing the job of giving you a session risk. Okay. And so let's move in. And as I show it in the demo, it'll make a lot more sense to you how these two things go hands in hand. And as I said, this is the same thing wherein we have, based upon the user context, you can the conditional access is going to say that, all right, fine, I see that this user is good, he's good to go, I can allow access, or something is wrong, I want to challenge him with an MFA, or maybe he's good to go, but I do not want him to maybe download anything to this device. Maybe this person is trying to access something on a kiosk computer, and I don't want him downloading documents or any kind of office resources, maybe from OneDrive or SharePoint. So I want to just give him only limited access. Or maybe this is something really weird. This guy, he just logged in from US few minutes back, and now he's trying to log in from somewhere in Europe. This literally can't be possible, right? And I want to ask for a password reset. So all these capabilities are possible using your Azure AD conditional access. Now, let me just show you a quick demo of what I've been talking about, because I've been talking for quite a while. It's better to visualize these solutions of how they work. For this, let me go into your and I'm going to take you to the Azure AD conditional access blade here. Okay, so these are all the policies that I have, but the one which I really want to focus on for this particular demo is block high risk users. Okay. So the tenant that I'm running, let me just give you a quick tour of the tenant, because that is really important, right? So what I'm basically running is M365 E5 tenant, and also which is why you would see an Azure AD Premium P2 license. And most of the things which I'm doing today, it requires you to have an Azure AD Premium P2 license. So please be mindful that you need a Premium P2 for that. Okay. I'll go here. I'll go back to my Azure AD conditional access. Okay, block high risk users. Just take a quick look at what this conditional access does. Okay, I'm going to apply this to all users. I just named it as block high risk users, and I'm going to say that all cloud apps. Okay, and the condition that I'm choosing is when the sign-in risk is high. I'm not saying the user risk, I'm saying the sign-in risk is high. Okay, now here comes the question. Who decides the sign-in risk? Where does the sign-in risk even comes from? Okay, so that is the job of your Azure AD identity protection. So let me just go back here, and I will try to come back here and Azure AD identity protection. Okay, this is a very new, I think it's been around for almost close to 2 years. This was in preview for a very long time, and just it's been a year or two where it went completely GA. Okay. And the identity protection is nothing but it is a solution which has high ML heuristics algorithm. It studies your profile. And as I said, this is the one which builds that profile for you, and it calculates the risk. Okay. The user risk policy. This is the policy that I'm talking about. Either you could go here and you can configure it, or you can just directly go to conditional access and say the sign in risk policy from there. So just so you know, like identity protection is the one which detects this sign in risk or a user risk. Okay. So I'm just going to say that. So any sign in wherein the sign in risk is considered as high. Okay. Please pay close attention here. When it is considered as high, I want to block the access. Okay. That's what I basically want to do, and I've set the policy to on. Okay. Now let's see what is the impact of this policy here. Okay, I'm logging into my demo VM here, and by the look and feel of this browser, you could very well tell that I'm using a Tor browser. So let me go into my, I'm trying to do Office 365 sign in. Come on, sign in. So I have a user in my domain by the name Jerry Thomas. So I'm gonna log in as J Thomas. Sign in. Let me supply the credentials. All right, so there you go. Pay close attention to this error. It says, hey, you cannot access this right now. Your sign-in was successful, but it does not meet the criteria to access this resource. For example, blah, 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 you might be signing. So this error might look like, and the reason why Microsoft is throwing such kind of an error is it doesn't really want to tip off the hacker saying that, hey, there is a conditional access saying so, and this conditional access is trying to block and you cannot do this. And that is enough for the hacker to get, to understand that, okay, right? Because they do not really want to tip off the user saying that this is the one which is blocking, okay? But however, you as an admin can always go back and understand what's happening here, right? For that, let me go back to the conditional access blade and take a look at insights and reporting. Okay. Now, just be mindful that for you to have insights and reporting working, you would need a Azure subscription. It requires you to have the Azure Log Analytics. So please make sure that your M365 tenant also has a Azure subscription tag to it, and you need this Azure subscription. Okay. I enabled this already in my tenant. I'm going here. I'm looking at conditional access policies. I'm just going to focus on block high risk user, this particular policy. And I'm going to say that I want to understand how this policy has been applied in the last 7 days. Okay. And it gives me a good information. It says, hey, it's total 6 users, success is 0, failure is 1, blah, blah, blah. I want to focus on failure. And if you take a look at this, it clearly says that, hey, this particular user called J Thomas, 12 count, blah, 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 and all these things, it clearly calls out. So on the back end, you would know where all this policy has been applied, who is the user on which it was applied, what exactly he has done, and everything comes out. Okay, you could even get one more level down, wherein you could go to your Azure AD sign-in logs. Okay, and maybe you want to just do a filter here based upon the username. I'm just going to say apply. Let me search for this user. Apply. And I want to look at the last, and if at all, the reason thing, the conditional access, it clearly says that, hey, you can say the basic info. It gives every information about the sign-in, the location, device info, authentication details, what other, and what kind of conditional access was applied during that sign-in. Okay, so it very well proves that this conditional access was applied, and that is the reason that person was blocked when he was trying to access from a Tor browser. Okay. Now, let me go back to my presentation here. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is, all right, fine. Now we understand how Azure AD conditional access plus identity protection works together hand in hand. Okay, but our problem is something else, right? So, well, it blocked, but what we want to try to solve is maybe the user came in, okay, but I really want to monitor what he's doing. Just think of a scenario wherein you're traveling somewhere, maybe you're in the airport, your manager suddenly calls you, which is something happens most of the time, right? He calls you and he says that, I want you to look into a particular document which you had and just give me that particular resource because the client is asking for that, okay? And you know that this document exists somewhere, maybe in your OneDrive or maybe in your SharePoint site. And maybe the mobile network is not really that great. You want to go to a kiosk computer which is in the airport, and you want to pull up that information, okay? And you're a genuine user. There is nothing wrong with you. You're a real employee. You're the genuine user. I just made a point that it is your manager, so you have to get that information, okay? Now this is the scenario in front of us. In these kind of scenarios, you really want to make sure that when you're accessing the resource, you get to access the resource only on read-only mode. You're not able to download it because that is a kiosk computer and you really don't want your corporate information being downloaded there. So you could be doing that, or maybe maybe you could come up with so many such scenarios, right? Maybe any document which is getting uploaded from it has to have a classification label. You want to block edit access, you want to give only read only access. You can think of a lot of such controls, and that is very well possible. And that can be done using your Azure AD conditional access plus Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. And just so you're wondering, what is Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps? It is nothing but Microsoft Cloud App Security, the CASB solution, which we all know. With the recent naming change, which Microsoft has introduced in Ignite, it has been renamed to Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So let's see this in action. Okay, for that, let me show you, go back to my Azure AD conditional access blade once again. I'm going to my Azure Active Directory, conditional access. I'll just talk about the conditional access, which so conditional access app control for Office 365 apps. This is the conditional access that I created for this. Okay, specific user. Now, I really want to test this only on a given specific user. So that's why I've just applied this on one single user on my tenant. I'm going to say all cloud apps. And the condition that I'm saying is uh, the device state. Okay, the device state, and it clearly says control user access when the user is signing in is not from a hybrid Azure AD joined or marked as compliant. So this is the condition which I'm saying, which simply means that, hey, if this guy is trying to access any M365 resource from a computer which is not joined to the domain, I want you to do what? It's simply saying, I'm just going to say a session control. And for you to make this work, and then the session control, I'm saying block downloads, which means he can access it, but he cannot download anything to the computer from which he's accessing from. That's what it simply means. Okay. Now let's see this in action, what this policy does. For this, let me just bring up this. If you see here, I've logged in as this user called as Adel Vens. Okay, and this is a computer which is where I'm trying to access from. This is a computer which is not joined to this domain. This is a computer which is not part of the domain, and that is what the conditional access even says. Let me go to my OneDrive here. Now, just pay close attention to what this says. And this is the power of you integrating your Azure AD with Microsoft Cloud App Security. And I'll show you how that integration is done. Okay, it clearly says, hey, access to your Microsoft OneDrive for Business is being monitored. Okay, and just take a look at this. Let me try to bring this up. I don't think this gets, well, sorry, my bad. But if you look at the URL here, right? You can clearly see that it is redirecting the login to MCAS, which is nothing but Microsoft Cloud App Security. If you normally access it, it will just say myapps.com or just vignesh.com slash the credential. I'm sorry, the URL for your OneDrive would look like something else. But this is where the power of your Cloud App Security reverse proxy comes into picture, wherein every single sign-in, it gets pushed to the Cloud App Security and it goes through that route, which is why it gets monitored. Okay. Now I'll say, OK, continue to Microsoft OneDrive for Business. Goes in. And maybe this is the PPT that I want to access. I can open it very well, but if I want to go ahead and download it, let me try to download. There you go. It says, hey, download blocked. And this is the organizational policy. This is what it is, blah, blah, blah. So that's what. So what it simply means that you get to access it only in read-only mode and you really don't get to download it. So this is the power of you integrating your Azure AD or whatever IDP solution that you have. And this only works on SAML-based apps and also apps which supports OpenID. So make sure that it is not all apps which supports it. So let me just show you the Cloud App Security of the house, that side of the house. Yeah, I'll go here. I'll quickly go to security. A lot of changes happening in this portal. It's quite hard to keep up with this. So yeah. I've just done minimal configuration, but a fully functional or a fully fledged deployment of Microsoft Cloud App Security or Defender for Cloud Apps won't look like this. Okay. Uh, So conditional access app control, you really need this to be configured. Only then you can call this on the conditional access, which I was showing there. Okay. And you can just go inside and you can completely monitor everything. It will completely show the activity log about what has been happening, everything. So you could really also set up alerts here. These alerts can be even pushed to a SIM. So this way you can completely monitor what is happening. Okay. All right, let's move on. And I believe a lot of the folks here are coming from a device management background. So you also know that you can very well define your device compliance policies using your Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So with that, when it goes hands on hand with Azure AD conditional access, also based upon that, you can also control the access which goes to Office 365. So if at all you haven't really configured this, this is really something which you should start looking at and enable this in your environment. And Azure AD conditional access report only mode. So every time you go ahead and deploy a conditional access, please be mindful, or at least when you're doing it in production, it's not really advisable for you to go ahead and turn it on just like that. So turn it on report only mode so that you can visualize the impact of it. And then is when you would go ahead and, or maybe visualize it, or maybe you want to sort of try it with only some pilot users. And then maybe you can deploy it, or you want to do a phase wise, maybe people from a particular business group, only for them you want to apply it, and then you want to go to a different business group. So there is a good way of planning that you need to do when you're deploying conditional access. And now you also need to make sure that you're deploying, you have a conditional access to block legacy authentication, because legacy authentication is also a weak link for attackers to come in and start, attacking your environment. So these are the applications which use such as POP3, IMAP. So you can really have a conditional access for that as well. I'll just quickly show how that looks like in action. I'll go to my conditional access blade. So I have a conditional access here which says block legacy auth. I'm applying it to all users, cloud apps, and the condition here is the client app. So make sure that you're checking these two, not these two, because when you have legacy auth turned on, you cannot have your MFA prompt, because your MFA needs modern auth. Okay, so any client in your, or any kind of application which is using IMAP or POP3 or any kind of legacy authentications, please make sure that you start getting rid of it, or your organization or your customers should start planning to retire those solutions and start looking at solutions which can supply modern auth. Okay, so please be mindful of that. But you can also have a conditional access in the interim to make sure that that is being blocked. But once again, this needs to be planned properly, because you're simply doing this, then if there are some legacy solutions running in your environment, then people can't access that. Okay. So insights and troubleshooting, which is something which I just showed when I was showing you how that policy was applied. Okay, now the third pillar, automate risk detection and remediation. Okay, so as I said, right, so this is where in this particular thing, I want to talk about the Azure AD identity protection. And once again, this is a P2 solution, and this is the one which is the engine which talks about the sign-in, which defines the risks. Okay, there is a lot more that it does, but let's take a look at what. So when a user signs in, okay, so these are all the different kind of risks which have been defined from the Azure AD identity protection. It could be an anomalous user behavior, suspicious inbox manipulation, and there is a lot. Password spray, anonymous IP, atypical travel, somebody who just signed in UK, with the next 30 seconds he's trying to sign in from US. Okay, leaked credentials, and Azure AD threat intel. This is something coming from Microsoft's own learning, where they were running commercial solutions such as Hotmail or Xbox for many years. Okay, so all this criteria as they go to this user risk engine, and that is how the user risk is defined. Okay, based upon this, it defines the whether the sign-in is highly risky, it's medium, or it is low. Okay, and then it sort of enforces control, whether for this risk should I allow the access, or should I challenge the user with an MFA prompt, or should I limit the access, or should I give a password prompt. This is once again the same different kind of risk types, and this keeps growing. Okay, this is something which was defined maybe a year back, and now I think there are a lot of other risk type which Microsoft has defined. Just to quickly show you this in action as well. For this, let me go to the identity protection blade. Yeah, so I'll just try to focus on the risky users. Okay, so this is as of today in my tenant, it thinks that Jerry Thomas and Vignesh, which is myself, it thinks that these are risky users, and this particular person is considered as a high risk. Now, the reason why this person is considered as a high risk is you can take a look at the risky sign-ins, and for the last 1 month, and take a look at this. This guy has been trying to signing in from different countries within a short span of time. And this is why it has set the bar, it has raised the bar and said, hey, this is a highly sign-in risk. And I showed you a conditional access policy which says any sign-in which comes with a high risk, I do not want that sign-in to happen. Okay. Either you could go to the conditional access blade and configure it there, or you also have the same thing here. This is nothing but the same thing. Okay. You can just come and say for user risk, whether you want to apply it for all users or if at all for lower risk, what do you want to do? Controls. Like, should I block access or should I give an MFA prompt? And similar way, you can also define your sign-in risk policy and also the MFA registration policy. So these are the three defined policies that you can define from the identity protection blade itself. Or if not, you can go to the conditional access blade and define it there as well. But the point that you need to bear in mind is the engine which defines the risk state of a user is your identity protection. Okay. And yeah, coming up. And this is the same thing which I just showed you. So these are the different identity protection policies that you have. This is something which I was just talking about. So in order to conclude, right, I spoke about Azure AD multi-factor authentication, conditional access, Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, which was known as your MCAS, and then identity protection. So individually, all these solutions have a lot to offer. Okay, there is no denying about that at all. But when you bring all these solutions together, they could even, you can take the protection to the next level, and that is something which I was just showing it to you. So if you as an org haven't done that already, or if you're in the planning roadmap, I would really start, I would really urge you folks to start looking at how you could integrate all these things together, so that way your security really gets, it's really strengthened much more than what it was before. And these are some good references that I want to share. So later when this slide is made available to you, you can go to these links and you can start building these capabilities in your tenant or even in your demo tenant and start practicing this. So thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure talking in this event. So if at all you have any questions, now I'm open to take that up. Thank you.
Thanks, Vignesh, for a wonderful session. It was really insightful. And I actually have a few questions related to the conditional access.
Sure.
So regarding the name location, so we are restricting for access from a particular location.
Mm-hmm.
Then if user is trying to use a VPN and change the IP of the location, like consider people from Nigeria, most of the organizations, they restrict connections from Nigeria, but people from Nigeria, what they are doing is they are using a VPN connection and connecting from UK. So is there any method to track that and block?
It's a good question. So what you're basically saying is they're coming in through a VPN.
Yeah, they are using a VPN and changing the IP and connecting from a different location.
No, not really. I haven't come across that scenario. I really have to check that and come back, honestly, because we haven't seen that kind of scenarios happening in our tenant. But that is a good way to prove that he or she is a legitimate user, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another question is, okay, I have a scenario where my customer is moving on to this conditional access, and they are going in phase wise. Okay, so they are enabling the conditional access for a particular group. Okay, and what if they want to add further users into that group, like adding additional nested groups? Will that work, or do we need to add users directly into that group?
Well, the way what I would say is it is always good to add users directly into that group. So these are security groups that you're talking about.
Yes,
right?
security groups. Yes.
It's always advisable to add the users directly into that group rather than having a nested group inside.
Okay. Yeah, that's something which I have read somewhere, like nested groups will
It will
always
not
give some
issues.
issues.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I just want to check whether conditional access also having the same problem or not.
And it's across any M365, even granting access to a resource using security group. So it's always been a problem. So it's not like your on-premises security group where things could work really fine. When it comes to the cloud world, it is always better to avoid that.
Right, right. Okay. Yep. Thanks for that. Let's check for some questions. Okay, we have one question from Ram. Let me publish it. And per user MFA versus conditional access, can we use both at same time?
Mm. So when you say per user MFA versus conditional access, can we use both? Well, you could, but what do you mean? So when you're saying per user MFA, it would by default be enabled, but when you're doing a conditional access, it comes in only based upon certain conditions. So the question is, as I said, right, you really need to be smart while deploying it, because if you're doing per user MFA and condition, then your conditional access really is not really doing anything, because your per user will always start prompting. So it's always a better practice to deploy your MFA using conditional access based upon saying that, hey, only under certain conditions, I want the MFA prompt to come in.
All right. And one more question from Ram. It's do we have a known issue with CA policies applied over group sync from on-prem AD?
Known issues, as in, I haven't really heard much, but do you want to talk about any specific issue that you have recently encountered? Because what you need to understand is your conditional access is always applied against Azure AD only. So it has nothing to talk to your on-prem AD. So the moment your account gets synced from your on-prem AD to your Azure AD, your conditional access can talk only to your Azure AD. So uh, I would like to know, like, if at all, is there any specific issue that you encountered? Then yeah, but I haven't really come across anything.
Right. Next one is, I think it's not a question, and I think Ram is again Ram is checking per user MFA is static.
Yeah. So that itself answers the question, right? It just keeps on prompting. So it is not dynamic as your conditional access wherein it throws. So as I said in the beginning, right? So if your question is per user MFA versus conditional access, I would always say go through a conditional access based MFA. That will always work for an enterprise.
Okay, great. One more question is, what is recommended to use, cloud group or on-prem group?
Well, I would say that, see, it depends, right? Most of the organizations, if at all you're having an on-prem Active Directory, and if you're syncing your security groups, uh, well, if that is what your business demands, then you want to do it. But if at all you ask me, where the most success happens is if you're creating a security group directly on the cloud. And that is much more beneficial, and that is much more better, rather than you syncing your security groups, whatever you have created in on-prem, to your cloud. But once again, that is a case-to-case basis. That totally depends upon, because if you have security groups which has been created on-prem, and maybe solutions such as your Exchange server, SharePoint server, SQL server somewhere, right? And you want to grab membership access to your on-prem solution, and you want to sync the same security group to cloud, so that you can grant membership access to any cloud resource, then there is nothing much that you can do about it. So it is always a case-to-case. You really need to know what the business demands. But recommended is if you're directly creating groups on the cloud. That is much more recommended.
Right, that's it with the questions, Vignesh.
Yeah,
I think we are all good. And once again, thank you for the wonderful informative session.
no problem. Been a pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.